How are things looking on the front?
Things become more and more dismal for the Ukrainians. It's crazy. This should not have happened. They should have withdrawn in good order, a month or two ago. And now it's not possible. And this is, again, not the first time this has happened. It happened in Ugledar, a little bit over a year ago. But the numbers there were smaller. We're talking about hundreds in Ugledar, that had to run across fields and that were just, killed by drones and small arms fire. But now this time in Pokrovsk, we're talking about thousands. Most of them are actually in that suburb, Minograd, which is to the west, or rather the east of Pokrovsk. And Pokrovsk itself is almost entirely occupied by the Russians. So they are there. I was just reading, I think just yesterday, that the Ukrainians are doing what they can to supply them, but they don't have any logistical line to them. Nothing on the ground. There's just no way to get them anything. So they're delivering them, for example, water by drone. And then, that's it. That's what these guys are surviving on. Clearly they can't hold out much longer, and they just must be, I just imagine the misery that they're enduring.
It's amazing they haven't surrendered then.
Yeah, some of them have, but yeah, a lot of them haven't. And that's a good question. I think it's a combination of ideological zeal, but also, there is constantly the story spread among the Ukrainians, again, that the Russians will torture, whoever they capture, they'll be subjected to months of torture. And I think that there's absolutely no evidence for this. This is but it's something that a lot of them actually believe it. This is what they hear, within Ukraine. So there's also fear. And then there are those who do want to surrender, but are afraid of being shot in the back by their comrades. All of those things. So we see, I hope, for their sake that they do surrender. And actually, again, it would actually be better for Ukraine because some of those could, in fact, go back and fight because the Russians will exchange them in prisoner exchanges, or at least they can be rejoined with their families. Again, for their sake, I hope they do surrender. But it looks like very few are surrendering, and most of them are going to die. They're going to die, be killed by a fab bomb there in Minograd, or to die trying to run across the field at night in that increasingly narrow belt of territory that it's not under Ukrainian control, but there is what we call a gray zone, a no man's land, only about a kilometer wide at its narrowest point. And again, in open fields, there's just your chance of getting through that. Again, like, you saw what happened. I think most of us did. What happened to that crew of the helicopter, when they landed, they were just immediately killed because they landed in that zone. It's essentially a kill zone. And it's through the kill zone that these poor soldiers will have to flee. Now, this is going on. That's the reality. And it's a reality that's recognized by actually most of the Ukrainians, or a lot of the Ukrainian telegram channels. It's not just the Russians that are saying this. There are many Ukrainians that are saying, and many of them are very, very angry about it. But Zelensky and his people insist that there's no problem. The situation's under control. I mean, this just seems like a very, very bad PR move. And again, it was just foolish from every point, from a humanitarian point, but also a military point of view, to leave those soldiers in Minograd. It served absolutely no purpose, and they are going to be sacrificed just to the stupidity and vanity of Zelensky.
We've talked before about the potential of Zelensky being either thrown under the bus from his Western backers, or just becoming too unpopular within the country. There was a political article out recently, I forget the headline of it, but it was very critical of Zelensky and saying there's a dark side to his regime. Do you think that this is a signal that when Pokrovsk falls and there's this disaster on the hand, the way that the West will handle it's like, oh, we would have won, NATO's super strong and powerful, but Zelensky just is a bad leader, so we got to get rid of him, and then we'll put in Zelensky or something.
Yeah, I don't think it signifies anything. And the reason I say that is that these kind of articles appear periodically, and they've been appearing for the last 2 or 3 years. And every once in a while, I think there clearly are people, within the, let's say, military and foreign policy establishments of the West who do not like Zelensky and want to see him go. And that may be what's responsible for these periodic articles. Um, but no, you can't really point to any rival now. He has been consolidating his power. He's actually, in so many ways, appears to be to have a firmer grip on power than he ever did at this. So I don't see him falling anytime soon. Now, it's true, that there is clearly frustration and real anger within the military. And I think he's probably more worried about the military than he's about the people. The people don't have guns. He doesn't care. He can keep them down. I think that's the truth. There is a lot of grumbling. I don't think there's nearly probably as much as there should be. But again, remember that he really does control that information space. And for the longest time, people, maybe that's starting to change within Ukraine like it is in the U.S., that the people are, especially this Pokrovsk seems to be a kind of a watershed moment where Ukrainian eyes are opening. And maybe that will lead to increasing skepticism of official sources of information. And that could, again, in the long run, or, we hope sooner in the medium term, have a real effect on, it may eventually endanger, Zelensky and his grip on power. But at present, he has a very firm grip. And I think at present, he's probably much more concerned about the military and some sort of, coup maybe coming from within the military. And there is, clearly, this anger that I've been talking about. A lot of that comes from the military. They know what's going on. The escaped comrades come, if the few that got through that field or whatever, and they tell them what happened, or, what they're seeing, and they know it to be true, and they know that their president is lying. And they know not only that their president is lying, but their commander, General Sersky, is lying too. Because General Sersky has been just every bit as culpable as Zelensky has been in this regard. So there is, I think there is a danger that there could be some sort of, let's say, insurrection within the military. And he may be aware of that, and he may, so there is talk that perhaps Sersky could go. Sersky has been, you think about it, Sersky took power actually right before the fall of Avdiivka. So he's just overseen, a lot of defeats. That's all he has to his credit, right? It's just so-called credit. It's been one city has fallen after another. In each case, he's lied along with Zelensky, and then, eventually it happens, and then you go to the next city or the next town. But this is one of the worst, and he just might not survive it. But the thing is, when you look at the alternatives, the people that are actually somewhat popular within the military, they are ultranationalists. People associated with the Azov Brigade, which now exists. I think it's called the 3rd Assault Brigade, and then there's another one. It's actually there are a couple of brigades now that are children of the Azov Brigade. But it's Azov people that we might end up with. And, they're probably more effective fighters, and they might actually be, more concerned with the lives of their own men, and that's why they're popular. It would make it a more difficult fight for the Russians, but in the end, I don't think it would. It would not change the outcome of this war. The Russians are going to win. They just might win a little more slowly if somebody with a better military head on his shoulders takes power.
Okay. Well, we'll see. I guess it doesn't really matter that much if Sersky gets replaced. Like you said, maybe things tactically might change slightly, but at the end of the day, we'll see more of the same. Something that, just the story that doesn't seem to die is the Tomahawks. It looked like that was kind of done. It was just the same thing really with the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, right? There was a lot of talk about it, and then no, we're not going to do it. And then they're already there, and then whoop, there it goes. They started going. Now, from what I heard with the Pentagon, that they're all ready to go. It's just all they're waiting for is just Trump to say, go for it. Which is that I remember us talking about that with the ATACMS. Was the plan is you just, don't worry, we're not going to use them, but we'll just kind of get them ready. And then they're just there in Ukraine. And then you get in a situation where look, it's really desperate, but we can just fix the problem. Just give the order and we can just push the button. They're all ready to launch. They're just ready to go. And then I think that's what they're doing with the Tomahawks. We got them there. They're all ready to go. Come on, Trump. Look, Pokrovsk is about to fall. Look, just we can turn this around. We got to hit Russia where it hurts. Their economy's reeling. You slapped on these secondary sanctions and the 19th sanction package from the EU. We just hit a couple of their oil refineries, and then boom, the Russian economy is up in flames.
Yeah, and then Putin will call you up and beg for mercy. Yeah, I'm sure
Do you think that's
probably right. Again, I guess the news recently is that the Pentagon has approved the Tomahawks. They're ready to go, and it's up to Trump, like you said. Yeah,
right?
And now that suggests again, there was a lot of talk about the Tomahawks before the Trump-Putin call just a few weeks ago. But after the call, Trump stopped talking about them, and it looked like it had been decided. He had decided against them, but against Trump. Now, of course, it's not, it's the Pentagon, so-called, but I don't think the Pentagon would go ahead with this if they weren't gaining some sort of signals from the White House that, you go ahead with this. And now Trump maybe is thinking that he can use this as pressure, but he has put himself on the escalation ladder. I think that eventually they are going to be approved. He will approve them. And, for all the reasons that you're giving, he's surrounded by people that are convinced him as things get worse, and they will. It's not just Pokrovsk, but it's going to continue to get worse. It may not be right now at the fall of Pokrovsk, but maybe sometime, like when Kramatorsk and Slavyansk are about to fall, at some point, or maybe before that. I'm not going to point to any time. They will be approved by Trump, and they will go to Ukraine. Now, probably the thing that's actually determining the schedule is the launchers. That's the big question. Do they actually have any launchers that they can use for these? And maybe they will cobble something together. And when that happens, we'll see Tomahawks in Ukraine. There will be of course, there will be some reason given for it, but maybe the real underlying reason will be the launchers.
Okay, so do you think then if the launchers they're there, then you think that they will be fired? We will end up firing Tomahawks into Ukraine at some point in the next 6 months, a year. This is actually going to happen, and if they do, right. I think Russia is done playing games. I think they tried for the first 6-9 months with Trump to think that maybe we can work with him, but from my understanding, right. I think it was Alexander Mercouris was just saying how it was actually at the Alaska summit meeting that it was, Trump that proposed, the end of the war, and Putin agreed to it. That it was right. Actually Putin agreed more or less to Trump's proposal, and then Trump just the next day just threw it all under the bus, and then then they have this Budapest meeting that's supposed to happen, and then he just cancels it. So I think Putin's got to be like, well, I just can't work with this guy. It's impossible now.
Right. Well, that seems to, that's more or less what happened. It's actually, Alexander Mercouris's analysis of this, which I think is very, very good, is based on some very detailed explanations that the foreign minister Lavrov gave in some extended interviews. And what he said, it was actually, remember back in August, it was Witkoff, was sent by Trump, and he came to Moscow with a proposal. And the Russians actually said, I think we can work with this. Now, he doesn't describe what it is, but from a number of leaks, and we've discussed this, it looks like it was, okay, the Ukrainians withdraw from all of the Donbass, and then we agree to at least a temporary ceasefire for Kherson and Zaporozhye. I think that's what it is. Now, Lavrov himself has not said that. Alexander Mercouris and others have come out and said that that's what it must be. And I think their logic is sound. I think they're right. I think that's what happened. And so in Alaska, it was, okay, Putin went there to actually to actually confirm, again, that the Russians had accepted the deal and we have a peace agreement, right? And it was presented. This is, again, what Lavrov says. It was presented to Trump and with Witkoff present. And Witkoff said, yes, that's, we're all there. And then when it was all over and Trump, instead of shaking hands and said, we got a deal, It's like, I'll go back and talk to the other guys about it, the Europeans and whatever. And then he said, then I'll get back to you. And he never got back to Putin. And that's, that I think plus the Tomahawks is what motivated Putin's call uh, just a few weeks ago to Trump. It's just like, okay, what? We've been waiting for you to we had a deal, right? This was the deal that you offered, and now you just run away. And then we got to talk about going to Budapest, because that was Trump's response. But clearly he was not ready. He had been basically persuaded, I think, by the people around him to renege on the deal. And so that's where, and the Russians are furious. That's right. And again, we had those very, very mild statements from Trump before the phone call and before the cancellation of the Budapest meeting. But after the cancellation of the Budapest meeting, not Trump, but rather Putin has clearly changed his attitude and is actually expressed in his own way, very subtly, some real anger and frustration, and has redrawn the red line regarding the Tomahawks, saying that there are going to be very serious consequences to that. And then he said overwhelming, and then Peskov said staggering. So they are, they have kind of redrawn the deterrence line. They let it go fuzzy for a while because they had real hopes that Trump would be different. And he was, you have to admit, in the first few months, things were different. And they hoped that they could build on that, but they've given up. So now we're back to where we were with Biden, and now instead of just of ATACMS, we're talking about Tomahawks, which have a much longer range. Just knowing Putin, he will retaliate. I think he would probably be careful, try to go slowly up the escalation ladder, which might be a mistake. But again, we understand the argument over this, that he would maybe use Oreshniks within Ukraine on maybe a government leadership target or something like that before he would actually go so far as to strike a NATO target. Now, he would be justified in doing this because this is clearly a NATO attack or you can say at least an American attack on Russia. That's what it would happen if the Tomahawk went in. Now, I think the severity of the retaliation will depend to some extent, maybe to a very great extent, on what kind of damage these Tomahawks do. Hopefully, they'll do very little damage. Again, they are subsonic. They're large. Maybe the Russians have been studying them for a long time. And maybe they won't have any problem shooting it down. But there's always something that's going to get through. And if it gets through and it hits a target right there in Moscow, close to the Kremlin or the Kremlin itself or something, then the pressure, I think to retaliate in a very severe way is going to be overwhelming. And let's just hope that that's not what happens.
Yeah, it just I don't know the plan that the West has for this war. It's just the salami slicing escalation we talk about, but every time we do it, NATO gets weaker, and then Russia just gets stronger. They learn how to neutralize these weapons. They ramp up their MIC more. We just kind of draw down stockpiles and aren't ramping up our MIC. Yeah. I don't. Do you think this will eventually get to the point where we're in an actual war? I mean, it's getting.
Yeah, I don't think so, but there is a real risk, and I think.
Do you not think so? Because America we're just so weak.
Yeah, I think that's probably it. Maybe at the beginning, the idea was we were going to destroy Russia. That was really it. We're economically, militarily, we're going to defeat them. We're going to carry out regime change. Maybe the more extreme version, we're going to break up Russia. All those things were on the table, and that's what they're hoping for. And now they have to understand, to a great extent that, okay, Russia really is very formidable. And again, I think that the introduction of these new weapons, the Poseidon and the Berezovnik, that has to have gotten through to some extent. I don't think they're totally insane. And it's just they really can't get themselves to admit defeat, but neither do I think that they really want to go there, to a direct war with Russia. So they're just going to go right up to the edge. And that's a very dangerous game because we could go over the edge, right?
Well,
We
what do you
could.
get from going right up to the edge? You just
Yeah.
all you're doing is just making your fall even more
Well,
horrific when
yeah,
you
that's
do
a good
fall,
thing.
right?
That's the problem with just not admitting reality. It's just look where we are. At the beginning, there was an awareness, okay, this is very dangerous. Ukraine, this could eventually, so even like Biden initially was reluctant to send tanks. And now we're talking about tomahawks. And, it just shows actually just, how reckless we've become, and we're reckless. We become this reckless. We've gone here because we're becoming desperate. Everything has failed. If those other things hadn't failed, if those tanks had really been so potent, or the HIMARS or whatever, and they had turned the tide, and there was a real stalemate, or the Ukrainians, in fact, were marching towards Russian territory, then this would never happen. It's because we're losing and they're running out of options that they're going to the more reckless options, the ones that they didn't even want to consider early on. So we're talking about tomahawks. We're talking about actually stealing their assets. That's where we are now. And they're just going to, because they cannot admit defeat, they're going to do that because it's the only thing out there. You're right. It doesn't really make sense. It's not going to change anything, but it's the only thing that they could actually pin hopes on because there's nothing else. And and now the last option, which is which you could call the real nuclear option, without in a figurative sense, is direct NATO intervention backed by the U.S.
It's just
And
not
I
going to
don't
happen.
think they're going to do that. I don't, but I don't, at the same time, I'm not confident that they won't because they are so deeply invested in this war, and it's so difficult for them to admit defeat. And again, these people, again, their grip on reality is not not at all firm.
It just doesn't make any sense. Like our government is currently shut down. Like people can't get food stamps, but we're able to go to war with Venezuela. Like there's something seriously wrong here, right? And I just don't think you're going to get any support for this. And just touching on Venezuela a bit, I feel like the U.S. might be getting scared. I think that they're massing these troops, but I think they realize that Russia has been supplying them with munitions, with air defense systems, missiles for their fighter jets. I wonder if we're going to go through with this because I feel like we've gone so far, but we won't make that move to actually execute the regime change because I think maybe there is some awareness that this may not go well.
Uh-huh.
But
Well,
but
possibly.
at the
Yeah.
same but the same thing, we actually talked about this before. We're saying like, why are we even doing this? And one thing that we said was just like America just feels like it needs a win to somehow demonstrate to the world that it has some power. But if it gets involved in this war and it doesn't go well, it's going to have the opposite effect. But many other analysts that I've actually listened to as well have drawn the same conclusion. Like really the main reason for doing a regime change in Venezuela, it's because Marco Rubio wants to do it, but also it's because these generals in the Pentagon, they say we need to reassert dominance. We need to show that we are a powerful force. That's the reason. It's such a pathetic reason to try to show that you're a tough guy by picking on some smaller country,
Yeah.
and it's not going to go well.
Yeah.
And you were talking about how will they potentially escalate with U.S. Weapon systems if they fire the Tomahawks. One thing is they might start to, instead of doing a direct attack on NATO, they'll just say, well, you're fighting a proxy war with us. You're funneling all these weapons and money into Ukraine. All right, here you go, Venezuela. Have some of these super awesome weapons that the U.S. can't counter. Or the say, we were talking about that potentially they would do that with the Houthis. So
Yeah.
I think if we go to war with Venezuela, if we do some type of strike, we won't say it's a war, regime change operation. If we ever going on the ground, I think it's going to be a quagmire. It's not going to go the way we think it will.
Yeah.
And
Knowing
then
Trump, I think that, well, first of all, I think their plan A is to actually just have a coup carried out with their assets there on the ground now. And that's maybe what they've been waiting for. And they're just creating the pressure for that. They're trying to support such an internal coup. That seems to be failing. Nothing has happened. It seems like Maduro is firmly in power. and they're not able to buy off people the way that they hoped they would. Again, we had that story about, I think it was a pilot that they were trying to to bribe into taking part in the coup, and he eventually just told him to go take a hike. And there's probably, that's probably just one instance. That's one that made it into the news, but there are probably 100 other attempts, and they seem to be failing. I think that's where we are. I think Plan B is to do some kind of decapitation strike, and maybe insert some sort of, let's say, kind of Contra-like force, again, maybe a force that's made up of Venezuelans disaffected with the Maduro government, and, hope that they can carry out a coup. I don't think that'll work. But I think that Trump, just knowing Trump, again, is observing him in both his first term and second term, he's not allergic to doing decapitation strikes. Soleimani in the first term, and then we had the strikes on the Iranian facilities. So that was not a decapitation strike, but an air raid. He's not he's willing to do those kind of things, but he likes those those quick in and out, and then announce great your glorious success, and then move on. That's what he's going to try to do, but I don't know that he can. Yeah, because he might act. Now, let's be honest. A decapitation strike might succeed. Maybe their intelligence is good enough, and they got enough missiles that can get through and accomplish that. But that doesn't mean that they have control over Venezuela and they can get the government that they want there. And I think that's the problem. You can create chaos. But to actually exert control, this is what America has found again and again in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. That's very costly. And I don't think I don't think Trump is, well, he's going to be very reluctant to go that route because it's going to be very unpopular with his base. They like, so many of them like those brilliant stunts, but they're not interested in a ground war. And a ground war in Venezuela could be a real nightmare.
But even if it's not a ground war, if they send in missiles, do some bombing campaign, doesn't Venezuela have some ability to respond? They do.
Well, apparently they do. Apparently they have some anti-ship missiles, and they have the S-300s, which they're an older, air defense system from Russia, but they're really quite effective. So there is always a risk that a ship will go down, or that aircraft would go down, and that that's going to severely detract from this image of success that Trump wants to project, and that's going to put him in a bind. It'll make it hard for him to proclaim victory and go home. It's just like, wait a second, they took down 2 of our planes and their pilots have been captured. How are you going to get them? Then one thing leads to another, and we could be in a real mess. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah, America, we love to dish it, but we can't take it. Like if planes go down, a ship goes down, we won't be able to handle it. That would just be too humiliating, too embarrassing, and there's no appetite for this. If people start coming back in body bags,
yeah,
it's going to be such a disaster. But what do you think? You think that this will happen, or do you think that we'll just pull back? But if we pull back, people just be like, "What the hell was this?"
Yeah, I think it's like he's gone so far. I don't. I think that they're going to attempt something.
Oh,
and again,
God.
I think it's just going to be an air raid of some sort. But maybe he'll pull it off. At least take out Maduro, and he'll declare that as some great victory. But it doesn't mean that he's actually gained control over Venezuela. It could be, okay, Maduro's gone, but there may be a more effective Bolivarian kind of leader that takes his place and is even more popular, and the Venezuelans are even angrier, again, than they ever were against the U.S. and much less likely to deal. Maduro was actually willing to deal and to give.
That's what I heard, right?
Yeah, give a share of control to U.S. oil companies. He was willing to go pretty far.
But the problem was we don't want Maduro.
Yeah, right.
It's it's so crazy. I mean, the fact that we know who we want. It's this Maria Machado. I forget her full name. The Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Yeah, Machado. Right.
Right. She wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and then like a month later, she tweets and says, "We need the U.S. to do a military intervention in her own country, Venezuela."
Yeah,
That's the Nobel Peace Prize winner.
I know.
Why I won the Nobel Peace? Time for war. Overthrow. Invade my country, America.
Yeah,
It's
I guess he didn't quite say that, but
more
she
or
implied
less.
that. Yeah, I said continue to escalate. I think that's what they need. So yeah, no, it's really bizarre.
It just shows just all of these Western institutions. They're all corrupted. They all exist to serve U.S. hegemony.
It seems to be true. I mean, it's very embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for Norway. Some of my ancestors came from there, and I'm very sad. Ashamed of what Norway has allowed itself to become.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Okay.
Sorry, Norway. But yeah, we'll end it on that note.
All right.
Okay. All right. Have a good rest of your day, and
you too.
I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.